Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the HVI podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Celene Lillie. Celene Lillie is a PhD and a lecturer at the University of Colorado Boulder and an adjunct professor at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. She lectures nationally, most often with the Jesus Seminar, and is the inaugural dean of the recently launched West Star Academy. Dr. Lillie is the author of The Rape of Eve, The Transformation of Roman Ideology in Three Early Christian Retellings of Genesis, which is this book right here. I have the affiliate link in the description below and in the live chat. And she's the director of translations for a new New Testament, edited by Hal Taussig, and a co-author of The Thunder Perfect Mind, a new translation and introduction. So it's good to have you back on the show, Celene. Hope everything's well.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Jacob. It's really great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for coming back on. So let's just do a little recap for those that may not have seen our previous video. What is the Rape of Eve?
So, and always when I start to talk about this, I like to remind people that I will be talking about sexual violence today. Right. So just so that you are aware of that as we kind of move through this topic. So the Rape of Eve refers to this incident in three retellings of the story of Adam and Eve. And so in the Nag Hammadi codices, which were discovered, found in 1947 in the area of Nag Hammadi, Egypt, there were about 52 tractates that were found there. Most likely these are associated with the Pacomian monastery there, although there's always debate among scholars about the purview of these texts. That said, the guess is that most of them are at least have some relationship to early Christianity, or at least they were texts that early Christians were interested in. Among them, again, are these three retellings of the Adam and Eve story, which we find in the Secret Revelation of John, sometimes spoken of as the Apocryphon of John, the reality of the rulers, or the hypostasis of the archons, and then in a text called On the Origin of the World. So this is where this story comes from.
Now, where exactly did they get the idea from? Because obviously we don't encounter the Rape of Eve in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Genesis. So we don't see that there. So where did those texts derive that information? Where did they get the idea from exactly?
So my going theory around this is that these texts, the ideas for this retelling really emerged out of their own culture. When they looked at the ideology of Roman conquest, which was centered around sexual violence, when they looked at the founding narratives of Rome, many of which are centered around sexual violence, and started using stories like these, stories like we find in places like Ovid's Metamorphosis of the transformation of Daphne into a tree as she's being pursued by Apollo. And they use these kind of various resources that are at their disposal to really make meaning of their contemporary lives. One of the ways we often do this is by taking ancient myths and recasting them to make sense of our contemporary realities. And so that's what I think these folks are doing. They're using this resource of the story of the creation of Adam and Eve and reflecting on it in terms of these wider stories from their social milieu to make new kinds of meanings, particularly about gender, ethics, and violence.
Did they get any of these ideas from the New Testament? Was the Rape of Eve inspired by anything that we see in the New Testament, or did it arise separate from the context of the New Testament writings?
Oh, this is a really interesting question. So, in these texts, we do see traces from folks like Paul, from Paul's letters. There seem to be some quotations and references to Paul's letters there. In these texts, we find references to gospels like the Gospel of Mark. And at the same time, they really seem to be leaning into the Jewish milieu. There are many references to works such as Isaiah, ideas that we find in the Torah beyond Genesis, of thinking about the character of God and who God is. I feel like it's difficult to say what an exact relationship, particularly around things like thinking about ethics and ideologies, that text that ended up becoming the New Testament might have had for the people who are putting these stories together. Of course, just to say at this time, at the time that we think these texts were being written, one of the dates we put out there for some of them is, in the mid to late 2nd century. The reason why we date some of the texts around this period is that we have a very similar storyline that's found in Irenaeus in his Against Heresies, which we date to around 180. So some version of this story is circulating, it seems, by this time period. But of course, we don't have a New Testament at this point, and we don't get our first list of books that matches our New Testament until the late 4th century in Athanasius's Festal letter. So it's a great question, and I think we need to do more work on it, Jacob.
Can you tell us about what those 3 texts tell us about the rape of Eve? Are they telling the same story, the same details, or does each text differ from one another on the major details?
So they all have very similar contours, although each of them casts the details in different ways. One of, I think, the most interesting versions of this, so just to kind of say a little bit about the story, and maybe to go back and just say, the story of Genesis, the first 4 chapters of Genesis, if you go back and read it, it's actually not one creation story, but two creation narratives. And in these 2 creation narratives, we get 2 different names of God. So in the first creation narrative, in 1 and 2, the name Elohim is used, and this gets translated as Theos in the Greek, which we translate as God in English. In the second narrative, which is the one where Eve is actually created from Adam's side, or Adam's rib, as it's sometimes translated, we have another name for God that's used. And here, Elohim and Yud-He-Vav-He, Yahweh, are used together. And this gets translated as Theos Kurios in Greek, and as the Lord God in English. And one of the things that I think these stories are doing, which is why the inner texts, I believe that these inner texts are these founding narratives of Rome and some of the larger ideologies in Roman conquest, colonization, are because this word kurios is also used to refer to the emperor. And of course, the emperors also are fashioned and sometimes fashion themselves as gods. And so I think this is one of the things that the texts are playing with. And so we get this idea kind of in parallel with the first creation narrative, that the realm of the heavens is created, and somehow there's some kind of rupture. This generally happens through wisdom or Sophia, and the texts describe this in different ways and with varying details. But from this rupture, the kind of material world as we know it comes to be. She has a child who is named Yaldabaoth, or there are some differing variations of this. And he basically thinks that he is the only thing around. And he says, a very famous line from the Hebrew Bible, I am God and no other exists beside me. And there's this voice that comes from the heavens and says, no, you're wrong. And in some of the texts, they refer to him as Samael. And Samael is, among other things, associated with the angel, the archangel of Rome in rabbinic texts. So again, just to kind of pull these various threads together with this. So in these stories, basically, so these lower gods, Yaldabaoth and his minions, hear this voice that says, no, you are wrong, Samael. And they decide that they want to capture this power and make it their own so that they can, wield this power and be kind of the primary source of power in the world. And so what they decide to do is they decide to fashion a human being. This is where they make Adam. And so this is kind of the story from On the Origin of the World. They huff and they puff and they cannot breathe life into him. And Wisdom Sophia feels bad about this and sends an emissary from her realm to help him. And this ends up being Eve, or life. And so Eve is actually the one who breathes life into him, and he gets a soul, but he can't stand. And then Eve says to him, Adam, stand, arise. And the text actually says her word becomes a work. So just like God in the first creation narrative, where God speaks things into being, here we have Eve kind of speaking reality into being. And of course, these lower gods get very jealous of her and decide that the way that they're going to take her power is actually to rape her. And what happens in this text is she knows that this is going to happen ahead of time, and her spirit leaves her body. So she splits or dissociates and goes into the tree of knowledge. And then another emissary is sent from the and she's horribly violated in this text. And then after this, she and Adam are set in Eden, and the snake is sent down, and the snake ends up being another emissary from the divine realm. And then, much like the Genesis narrative, one other thing, sorry about this, that's really important about this, is that
no problem.
Yeah, in this version of it, one of the things that the text says is that the rulers put a sleep on Adam. So this idea that when in the Genesis text, he's put to sleep and then Eve is taken from his side. But in this text, it says that they put a sleep on Adam so that and tell him a story that Eve comes from his side, so that women will think that they're subordinate to men, and that then the children that come from their violation of Eve will actually be subordinate to the rulers as well. So it's this whole machination so that we get gendered hierarchy and this hierarchy between the rulers and the rest of humanity, and just to notice that this all happens with deception and violence. So I think this is one of the major critiques of this text about how gender hierarchy in particular is fashioned or made from the story of Adam and Eve. So anyway, so we're back in the Garden of Eden. The story looks really similar again to what we find in Genesis. And the snake, says, were you told not to eat from the tree? Eve says yes. And, if we even touch it, we'll die. And the snake says, no, you're not going to die. And so Eve eats then from the tree, and, in many ways reintegrating. So her spirit was in the tree. So this becomes a way of kind of eating or ingesting that which had dissociated before the violence perpetrated on her. And Adam eats this as well. And it says that they become really co-partners in this, and that their eyes are opened and they're able to tell good human beings from bad human beings. So part of it is about this discernment, this ethical discernment about people. So the texts basically say then, the lineage of their children will end up being the saviors of humanity, but Eve kind of leaves the texts in many ways after this, after the eating of the fruit of the tree. So that's kind of what the last we hear from her in this.
We have a super chat question from iFish and Thank you for your super chat. It is potentially off topic, but he asks, approximately when did Judaism become monotheism? So let me rephrase that question. I think how we should put that question instead in the context of this conversation is, was the rape of Eve stories influenced in any way by an older form of Judaism that kind of survived in different Jewish groups or apocryphal texts? Is there maybe sprinkles of polytheism that are kind of slipping through and surviving in some new form? And another part to that question is Plato's demiurge and Plato and Plutarch involved in influencing those stories?
So these are all really great questions, and thanks to the person who asked this one. So this is a hotly debated topic around what are we talking about when we're looking at ancient Judaism, and is it actually monotheism? And just to say, we have figures like wisdom, who seem to be Shekinah, who seem to be hypostases, and so they're not quite God, but they function in the divine realm. We also have all kinds of angels and other divine beings that are functioning. And I think it's a really interesting question to ask, what did people in the ancient world think about this? And I always find, and I joke with this with my students too, it's not a very satisfying answer. I don't think we can know 100% what this looked like. But we do know, sorry, as I backtrack around this, I would say we can be pretty certain that, the divine was around part of the ether for culture in the ancient world in just a very different way than we tend to think about it in the modern world. And is it possible that they still thought about themselves as a monotheistic people, while at the same time having these other kinds of divine beings? Absolutely. One of the ideas in ancient Judaism, we see this in the New Testament, we see this with the rabbis, where as above, so below. And so, each of the nations has its own angel. And if there's fighting going on the earth, we get a parallel to this in the heavens. So there's all kinds of ways that we need to think about, what do we mean when we say monotheism, and what are the nuances of what this might have looked like in the ancient world. And Jacob, you had another addendum to this that I would love for you to repeat.
Yeah, Plato and Plutarch, were they involved in influencing these three stories of the rape of Eve?
So folks are definitely reading Plato, who are looking at these stories. One of the other people who I might name is Philo, who is an Alexandrian Jewish interpreter of scripture, who's really looking at Platonizing readings of the Hebrew scriptures. And he's another person who, in his commentaries on Genesis, talks about these two creation narratives and thinks about them in terms of, Platonic ideals. One of the questions that I have asked, and that I still kind of keep asking, is, it has kind of been the going interpretation for these texts to really heavily lean in to Platonism without looking kind of at the myriad of possible other influences. And I still think there's a lot of work to do there. Not saying that Platonic readings are not part of what's happening, but I do think there are so many influences here that we're still just scratching the surface of the possible types of meanings these texts are trying to make, as well as the resources that they're using to fashion these meanings.
And what about the story of Mars and Rhea Silvia? Does that story also influence the Rape of Eve, and how similar are the two stories?
So, this is one of these stories that I do think is a part of an intertext for the story of Eve here. And just to say, we do have, so this is one of the founding narratives of Rome, one of the most important, because it's through this story that Romulus, the founder of Rome, is born. And, we know second, third century, people are still putting this story on sarcophagi. It's found in the Roman Forum. It's on coins. There are reenactments of it. So, again, just to note, sometimes we think of these stories and think about them, particularly in their written form, of being just the purview of the elite. But this is something that, regular everyday Roman citizens would have known about. And so in this story, Rhea Silvia is the daughter of the king, and her uncle wants to rule the land, and so she kills her father, and he kills her father, he kills her brothers, and then makes her a Vestal Virgin. So these are the women who are the keepers of the hearth fire of Rome, and basically the time that they serve is the entirety of their childbearing years. And so the text says that she's given this role as an honor, but it's really to make sure that she doesn't have children. And so there are, like so many other stories in the ancient world, there are many, many versions of this story. And she goes to fetch water in the field of Mars, and Mars sees her and rapes her, and she becomes pregnant. And she gets pregnant with twins, Romulus and Remus. The twins are put in a basket in the river, and a she-wolf or a lupa finds the twins, and then they suckle at the teats of the she-wolf. If any of you have ever been to Rome, this image of Rome is ubiquitous. You will see it on sewer covers and public fountains and cornerstones of the she-wolf with Romulus and Remus suckling at her teats. And so this is one of, so, again, so this thing of a god coming down, of oftentimes in the translations, they talk about this as ravaging, but I really think calling it rape is extraordinarily important, and much more along the lines of what's happening in many of these stories. And of course, what is this? Her body is usable. And so the god coming down, the founders of Rome are born. So I think this is one of the many stories that begins to form, that plays a role in the formation of whoever is putting together this story of Eve.
Which one of these, actually, let me rephrase. What do you think is the catalyst that caused these stories to be created regarding the Rape of Eve?
So, again, I wish we could know for sure. But the things that I would guess about these communities is, one, they noticed the violence and sexual violence going on in their own worlds, and were trying to make sense of what might allow this type of violence and harm to happen. So I definitely think that that's one of the things that probably is contributes to these stories. Rome's entire figuring of conquest falls along the lines of sexual violence. So there are many different buildings, friezes throughout the empire where the nations are figured as women, and the emperor is figured as kind of the penetrating male god who penetrates into the nations and takes them over, exploiting them for their resources. So this is, I think, another thing that they probably saw in their purview. Again, if these are folks who, and it would have been several generations later at this point, but if these are folks who come from Jewish traditions, Christianized Jewish traditions, the destruction of the temple, the sack of Jerusalem happens in 70, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt is in the 130s. And so, this community in particular has this type of history with the Romans themselves. And so this might be one of the ways in which they were working out, how do we account for this type of evil and destruction from the rulers in during our time period. And just to say, we see this even in Josephus. One of the reigning ideas of the ancient world is that if you win a war like this, the gods are certainly on your side. And so one of the things then that these texts do are bring that into question to say, wait a second, just because these folks won, if we think about the violence that's being perpetrated, does that mean that God is actually a violent God? And so I think this is one of the ways in which this question may have been answered for these folks. And then the last thing maybe that I'll say is that I think a lot of this has to do with gendered hierarchy, with this idea that women are subordinate, are usable, and that they're ripe for violation. And this text clearly says that this is not actually part of the will of the divine, that any kind of violence, that any kind of subjugation is actually not from the divine realm, but from these other quote unquote gods who are really just ineffectual rulers that think that violence is the only way to gain power. And this is, I think these texts are particularly critiquing this as well.
What are the connections between these texts that talk about the rape of Eve with Gnostic groups and their views of Yaldabaoth? Does that plug in? Is that connected at all?
So I think, Jacob, this is one of the things that I continue to kind of look at is, so obviously Yaldabaoth is a part of these texts. And I think the question is, how are we reading this figure? And generally in scholarship, this figure has been read as the God of the Hebrew Bible. It's been read as part of a larger system of pretty extreme dualism between the spiritual and the material world, a material world which is denigrated. And I guess this is one of the interventions that I am trying to make with my work, that I don't actually know how much we can say these texts that are talking about Yaldabaoth are about. I guess just to say this really clearly too, one of the things that comes with some of these interpretations then is that these Gnostics, these Christian Gnostics, are actually anti-Semitic and trying to say that the God of the Hebrew Bible is bad. This is what I'm trying to intervene in my own scholarship. And I have some major questions about this, if this is the case. One of the things that I wonder is if, rather than this being about kind of recasting the God of the Hebrew Bible, if this is really about recasting these emperors who claim to be gods and saying, no, these are not real gods. This one true God is not interested in this type of violence, in this type of hierarchy. What we see in the material world, as far as this is concerned, was not part of the plan of the divine realm. The other thing that I would just note about this is that some of the interpretations that around this are this idea then that humanity or the material world is fallen. But these texts really seem to care about taking care of the material world. This is, I think, a huge interest of theirs in particular ways, particularly of taking care of other human beings. One of the things at the very end of On the Origin of the World, it actually says that, people will know which realm you're from on the basis of your actions. And so if we're talking about actions, these have real material consequences for folks. Violence or the lack thereof has real material consequences for folks. And I think it's short-sighted to think that these texts aren't interested in this, that they aren't interested in thinking about new ways in which it might be possible to live with one another in the material world itself. So again, maybe not a satisfying answer around, coming down with one opinion on who Yaldabaoth is, what's going on in these texts. But I also, again, I just think, and I'm so grateful for all of the scholarship that's been done on these texts over the last 50 years. And I still think we're just scratching the surface in terms of our interpretations or possibilities, possible interpretations of what these texts, the work that these texts might have been trying to do in the ancient world.
What about the narrative of the Sabines? What similarities do you find there between that narrative and the rape of Eve?
Yeah, so the Sabine women. So this is kind of one of these next moments of the founding of Rome, and Romulus has put together a community of only men, and the texts say, not the best men in the area. And so they realize that after they kind of say after a generation or two, they realize that there's going to be no one left if there aren't women to bear them children. And so they go to their neighbors to ask for intermarriage as a way of both getting women for themselves and for creating alliances. And the neighboring communities don't want to have anything to do with these Romans. So Romulus seems to clearly feel slighted in these texts. And so what he decides to do is he's going to plot and plan so that he can steal the women from his neighbors. So he puts on a big festival. He invites all the neighbors there under the guise of, he feeds them. He gives them games. And in the middle of one of the games, he gives a signal, and all of the Roman men basically snatch up Roman women. And this is actually, which I always find so fascinating. They talk about that this is the place where the ritual of carrying a woman over the threshold, newly married couple, the woman gets carried over the threshold, comes from, because the Sabine women would not go into the Romans' homes of their own accord. So eventually, the Sabine women have the Romans' children. There's all-out war under the pretext of kind of defending the women's honor, but it's really because they're worried about the type of power that Romulus is accruing. And one by one, he defeats all of these neighboring peoples. He brings many of them back to Rome itself, and then he settles those communities with Romans. So he creates little colonies out of these neighboring communities. And eventually, the women are so disturbed that they walk onto an active battlefield and say to their fathers, you're going to make us widows if you kill our husbands, and say to their husbands, you're going to make us orphans if you kill if you kill our fathers. And so this intervention really stops the war. But throughout this narrative, what are the thematic things that we can see that connect with with these narratives of the rape of Eve? So we have this idea of the rulers plotting and planning to get what they want and to be able to maintain their power. So we see this both with the rulers in the rape of Eve narratives, and we see this with the rulers in, here we've in Rhea Silvia's narrative where they plot and plan, in the rape of the Sabine women where they plot and plan. And then this idea that this subordination of women and sexual violence is absolutely justified if it means that we get to maintain our power over others. And again, I think this is the very, very thing that these texts that retell the Adam and Eve story are trying to are pushing up against.
What about the story of Apollo and Daphne?
Yeah. So I think this is one of the places where, and just to say, Karen King was, Berger Pearson had a little note about this. Karen King kind of expanded on it. And, but this idea of thinking like, where in the world would someone get the idea that, that someone who's being pursued would turn into a tree? And well, we have this ready-made narrative with the story of Apollo and Daphne. I particularly think the story from Ovid's Metamorphosis is interesting, particularly because it is, so these retellings of, so the stories that we have around Rhea Silvia, the Sabine women, well, they predate this. One of the major periods of time that they were written down in was when Augustus becomes the Roman emperor, when he starts the Roman Empire. And so looking at this constellation of how these ancient stories are supposed to recast Augustus's reign in certain ways is really, really important. And so that's one of the reasons why I like this version from Ovid so much, is because it brings in these themes that we see in something like the story of Rhea Silvia, the story of the Sabine women, and connects them very concretely with this image that we get of Daphne turning into a tree. So in Ovid's version of this, what happens is Apollo kills the python, and he has kind of this little back and forth with Cupid, and he is not very nice to Cupid. And Cupid's like, you think you're so great with your arrows. Let me show you something. And so he shoots a lead arrow into Daphne's hurt to make her flee, and shoots another arrow into Apollo's hurt to make him fall in love with Daphne. So Daphne is a nymph, and she wants nothing more than to follow the goddess Diana. So Apollo's twin sister, the goddess of the hunt, the maiden who doesn't need a man, and because she doesn't have a family, can run through the woods and hunt and kind of do what she wants to her heart's content. And so this is the life that Daphne wants, and Apollo is desperately pursuing her. So again, just to note that this is a plot. It's these machinations between these arrogant gods who are trying to make a point to one another, and who literally gets caught in the crossfire is Daphne. And basically, Apollo is lapping at her heels, and she begs her father to save her from Apollo. And how does he do this? Is he turns her into a tree. So Daphne is the Greek word for laurel. And laurel bay leaves. So just to give you a visual on this. And at ancient games, at triumphs, winners, whether they were military leaders or the winners of the games, were crowned with a wreath of laurel quite often. And so what Apollo says as she turns into the tree, if you can't be my bride, then you'll be my tree, and I will use you to adorn myself, to make these crowns with. So because she can no longer run, she actually becomes this very usable thing for Apollo in this transformation. Again, we have all kinds of images of this in the ancient world, particularly mosaics. So this would have been an image and a story that people would have known. At the end of this telling by Ovid, he actually talks about how the laurel adorns Augustus's head. The laurel also adorned Romulus's head every time he had a triumph from conquering these neighboring communities. And there were laurel trees planted at his house, at Augustus's house on the Palatine Hill. So again, there are all of these intertexts then between the imagery and Roman politics and conquest and gender roles that are going on at the same time in this story.
If you had to pick, which one of these ancient narratives is the most similar to the Rape of Eve story?
Ooh, this is a really interesting question. And I don't know if any of them are more similar than others, but rather they kind of share a constellation of themes and ideas. And I guess what I'd say is it would really surprise me if the people putting together these retellings of the Adam and Eve story didn't have contact with these stories. And it would surprise me if they weren't using them as resources to rethink the possibilities of the Adam and Eve story.
We have a super chat question from my fishnet tie again. Thank you for another super chat. Do these texts mention angels raping women, creating Nephilim, or women needing to cover their hair to prevent this from happening?
So we don't have the covering of the hair, which my guess is you're super knowledgeable about this. And so, thinking about First Corinthians or something like that. But so this idea of the sons of God coming down to the daughters of human beings, and again, it's not explicit exactly what's happening between these two types of beings, but it does seem to be some kind of force in the opinions of a lot of people reading these texts. In the secret, so one of the things I think that it might be interesting to think about more is if someone like Yaldabaoth is a child of Sophia, in a way, he's kind of one of these in-between beings. And is there a way to think about him in the context of the Nephilim more generally? And I don't know, off the top of my head, I don't know. I can't really think of anyone who's done a deep dive into looking at those connections. The second thing that I'd note about this is that this is mentioned in the Secret Revelation of John. There is towards the very end, there's a piece that talks about this section from Genesis 6, and also parallels the book of Enoch, talking about the daughters of human beings being beguiled by the sons of God, and basically getting set up into the trappings of culture and civilization. So the introduction of metals for weapons, of all kinds of things connected with metallurgy, with makeup and the painting of faces. And so there is a reference to this again in the Secret Revelation of John. And I do think that it specifically draws on this piece of First Enoch as a way to critique the violence and excesses of civilization during the time. Great. It's a really great question. And again, it's another area that I just think is ripe for a lot more research.
How does the rape of Eve alter the narrative of Abel and Cain in Christian tradition?
So, one of the things that, so the text, not all the texts, so the texts deal with Cain and Abel in different ways. One of the storylines is that they are actually the product of, so they're the progeny from this violation of Yaldabaoth. Other texts don't talk about it in quite the same way. In the reality of the rulers, we do get the story of Cain killing Abel. And in that version, it does talk about, Seth being this replacement child, but there's also another child that's born, Noria, who is really talked about as being the savior of humanity. So again, in that next generation, we get this female savior figure in reality of the rulers. Mostly the texts do seem to, follow the narrative that we find in Genesis, but it doesn't, it's not a place that they always seem to be making a lot of excess and new meaning in the same way that we find with the Adam and Eve portion of the narrative.
Were these stories about the rape of Eve very well known in Christianity in those days, or did not many of them actually read about those stories? Or was it very popular at one time and did it die out later?
Yeah, again, I think this is a great question that I wish we could know. I wish we could know the answer to. I think that the several things that I think about this are that, so we have, 3 different texts from Nag Hammadi that we find this story in. While the rape of Eve isn't specifically talked about, this cosmology again shows up in Irenaeus, who's writing in southern France. And so if we have these ideas and these storylines, or at least part of these storylines in, everywhere in the empire from France to Egypt, it makes me wonder, it does make me wonder how widespread they are. The fact that there are different versions of this, does this mean that there were these different versions circulating, that when the story embedded itself in certain places, that people changed the details to reflect what was most important to them? Again, I don't think we can know the answer to these questions, but the fact that we have this story showing up in so many places, I think we can't dismiss the possibility that at least among certain folks, that this was a widespread story that people were engaging with.
What did the early Christian teachers and or church fathers that encountered these texts think about them?
they did not like these texts very much. And, you know, again, it was this idea of, so there were everything from charges of elitism, of that, you know, it was special knowledge that was only meant for a few, that it wasn't accessible to people, that they were these texts came from trajectories of heretics, of people who believe different things. And I think, again, you know, I just want to name the work of Karen King and Michael Williams in particular on this, of thinking about the ways in which our inherited narrative about orthodoxy has shaped the way that we think about the diversity in the ancient world, and that there were lots of different types of Christianity, belief systems, ethics, morals, etc., happening within these early Jesus groups at the time, and that they were all sometimes fighting, sometimes in conversation with one another about what was the right interpretation of the Jesus story. So, you know, the people who've been preserved because they won the day are the voices that we hear kind of attacking these stories the most. In the ancient world, this word that we get heresy from, heresis, really was about just different sects. And so every philosophy could really be considered kind of a heresis. And what is it? And I think, again, this is one of the questions that I continue to ask is, how can we think about early Christianity in different ways when we don't just think about it in these polarized terms? You know, we're in an election year this year in the United States, and it's one of the places where, you know, the polarization and rhetoric that we get in the media on both sides so often doesn't reflect the complex reality of where so many individuals are coming from. And I think this is a lesson that we really need to transpose still back in the ancient world as we ask questions about what's going on. But they really disliked these texts, and it was everything from, you know, the people who were, again, the people who wrote them hated the God of the Hebrew Bible. Some people said they were too ascetic. Others said they were too libertine. They said they hated women. They said that they hated the material world. So there were all kinds of charges levied against these folks. And whether that actually reflects the reality in any way of their ideas, belief systems, ethics, communities, it's really difficult to know.
We have a super chat question from S. Mill. Thank you for your super chat. When you say widespread occurrence of the story, what all communities was the rape of Eve appearing in besides Sethians?
Yeah, so this is one of the questions that I'd ask about this is, you know, like talking about a category like the Sethians, it really is a modern category that we've imposed on the ancient world in certain ways. And so if we're going to talk about the Sethians, you know, what were they doing? It seems that several of these texts don't really care about Seth. Particularly, I'm thinking about something like the reality of the rulers, or or otherwise known as the hypostasis of the archons, where they don't seem to care about Seth at all, but who they end up being interested in is Noria. So I think it's an interesting question. I don't think we can know, and I would want to interrogate a little bit the category of the Sethians to start with. But really great question. And these are exactly the type of questions that I think we should be asking more of.
Indeed. And I just want to remind everybody real quick that the Amazon affiliate link to purchase The Rape of Eve is in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment, and it's also pinned in the live chat. Thank you for joining me today, Celene Lillie.
Thanks so much, Jacob. It's been really great to be here, and thanks to everybody who's been listening today.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.